Not seen some of you in some time, but my name is David Adler. I'm the co-general coordinator of the Progressive International and one of the coordinators of this summer school. It's been exciting for us to put together this inaugural summer school featuring so many of our favorite and world-leading thinkers to cover issues such as what is global capitalism, what's happening in the financial system, what's happening in terms of the thing we call extractivism and extractive sectors across the world. But I would argue that today's lecture is one of the missing pieces, and is absolutely crucial to our sense of the past, present, and certainly the future of global capitalism, and that is the question of money. We hear this all the time in the international press today about how the international monetary system is undergoing some tectonic transformation. We've heard a lot about the role of the US dollar and the potential for its waning hegemony. But it's oftentimes very technical, and people are disagreeing with each other, but oftentimes talking past each other. And to actually make sense of what is the global monetary system? What does it mean for people to live in a place like Senegal as opposed to a place like Canada, live in a place like Argentina, which is always wondering what to do with its monetary system, what money to use, whether to make it a buy monetary system or to use the dollar or to peg it to the dollar. These monetary questions are technical, but they're also fundamental to the livelihood of economies around the world in such uneven ways that to make sense of this, I think, is really central to our project at the Progressive International, and certainly to our intellectual understanding of the global economy. So I'm extremely happy, delighted, grateful to welcome one of my favorite thinkers today, and a friend of the Progressive International, Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla of Senegal. Ndongo has worn many hats over the years as a technical advisor to the presidency of Senegal, working in the third sector, currently at working for ideas, which, if I get the acronym right, is the International Development Economics Associates, which means basically helping to convene serious conversations across the global South about many of the questions that we've been discussing over the course of this summer school, including an upcoming very important conference. I believe it's the third conference that will be convened in Addis Ababa next month on monetary sovereignty in Africa. And that's part and parcel of one of the major projects that Ndongo has been leading, and is the co-author of a very important book on this, about the franc zone, in the colonial franc zone in Africa. The last, I believe the title of the book corresponds to this, Africa's Last Colonial Currency. So these are fascinating questions. They're central questions, and they're questions that Ndongo has over many years set out to answer in his academic work, in his policy work, in his advocacy work. So I cannot think of a better person to guide us through this conversation that's often very technical and inaccessible to a lay audience than our friend Ndongo. And once again, I want to thank you. I know your schedule is unbelievably busy. I know that we've been chasing you to get this lecture into the calendar. So without further ado, I want to pass it over to you, Ndongo, and have you share your screen so we can all see your slides. And thank you all again for making time. We know that we've been patchy on organizing, and it's come a few weeks late, but as a crowning lecture for this summer school, I'm really, really happy to be able to hear from Ndongo about this central pillar of global capitalism today. So over to you. Thank you again. Thank you to all you for joining us, and I look forward to the lecture to come. So over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be here among all of you and to have the chance to exchange on a very important topic, as David said. I will try to share my screen with you as I prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Yes. Okay. Do you see my screen?
We do see your screen, yes.
Oh,
it works perfectly.
Fantastic. So my talk today is about monetary imperialism, and introduction. There are many elements of this presentation which are thoughts, which are not very elaborated yet. But I think it will be part of the conversation to flesh out some points. As David said in his introduction, money is a very important topic, and yet it is not really discussed. And in our policy strategies, we do not often think about the importance of money or how we could shape our monetary systems differently. Okay, try to, okay. So monetary imperialism for me is about the nexus between money and empire. And when we talk about empire, it's not something of the past. It's the past, it's the present. And hopefully we want a future where there is no longer be any empire or any hegemonic power. So monetary imperialism is about the nexus between money and empire, how empire consolidates through monetary domination, and how monetary domination maintains empire. Generally speaking, from an historical point of view, monetary domination follows other forms of imperial domination, like military domination, for example. But to sustain themselves, empires need some form of monetary domination, monetary and financial domination. And I'll try to illustrate that. But the major point I would like to make here is that monetary imperialism refers, from my perspective, to a set of practices of economic exploitation and surplus extraction, which make the weakened nations and their exploited labor pay themselves for the cost of their own exploitation in ways that are hardly transparent. That means monetary imperialism is a very vicious system where the dominated nations, their exploited labor, they will contribute themselves to pay the cost for their own exploitation. And generally, the mechanisms are not really transparent to these nations themselves and to their populations. And that's why I think it's important to discuss about what is money and what money plays in imperial domination. And to that end, I will rely on the insights of a body of heterodox economic theory called modern money theory, MMT. So the plan of this talk is very simple. Part one is money as debt, the nature of money, and how money was used during colonial times. And I will elaborate that with the idea of currency hierarchy. The second part will be an illustration of the theoretical developments in part one with the CFA franc, currency used in former French colonies in Africa, still used, and which in our book we called Africa's last colonial currency. So the first part, money as debt, colonialism, and currency hierarchy. Mainstream economics defines the functions of money. Generally, they will teach students that money has a number of functions: unit of account, means of payment, store of value. The functions explain what money does, but the functions of money do not explain what money is. And from mainstream economics, money is generally conceived as a commodity, like gold or silver or any other commodity. So for mainstream economics, money tend to be conceived as commodity, as a scarce thing, and also something that is generally neutral in economic relationships. But for most traditions of heterodox economics, and also MMT in it, money is not a commodity. Money is the debt, a debt relationship. And we could say more specifically, money is debt denominated in the money unit of account. So you have different types of monies issued by different type of economic entities. So generally, we could call currency the debt, the money issued by the government, to distinguish from the other monies, other debts issued by other economic actors, like, for example, households, corporations, etc. So we could also distinguish the currency issuer, that means the central bank and the treasury, from the currency users, like people like ourselves, individuals, households, and corporations. Because as we could see in this picture, in every monetary system, you have a monetary hierarchy. I mean, in any country that issues its own currency, you have a pyramid of debts, a pyramid of monies. On the left, you could see non-bank IOUs. For example, is the IOUs that individuals could issue towards each other, or some corporations could issue towards each other. You have bank IOUs, generally it's bank deposits. So these also are monies, are debt, liabilities issued by the banking system. But at the top of the pyramid, you have the government IOUs. It's the currency, the sovereign debt issued by the government. So you could think of coins, you could think of banknotes, you could think also of electronic money, generally called central bank reserves or high-powered money. But you have two type of, let's say, monetary systems, domestically speaking. You have systems that are sovereign in the sense that the government IOUs, the high-powered money, is not pegged to any metal, any gold, nothing. It's free floating. In that case, we talk about fiat currency, saying that, for example, the US dollar is not pegged to gold or any other currency. Same thing for the Canadian dollar, same thing for the UK pound sterling. These are sovereign currencies in the sense that the liabilities issued by the government are not pegged to any metal. But you could have non-sovereign currencies. For example, when you have the currency of the government being pegged to a metal or to another currency. For example, as we'll see, the CFA franc is pegged to the euro. You have other nations that made the choice to peg their currency. This limits what is generally called the monetary sovereignty, that means the financial independence of the government. Because if you peg your currency, you promise to convert your currencies in someone else's currencies at a fixed rate. And you need to accumulate the currency, that means the debt issued by other banking system, in order to honor that promise. But this figure is valid for every monetary system, domestically speaking. But at the international level, you have also a hierarchy of currencies, because you have currencies that are dominant over others. And that's the case, for example, of the US dollar. Here you could see a graph derived from IMF data is the currency composition of official foreign exchange reserves held by central banks, Carter 3, 2023. So you could see here, for example, that 59.2% of all foreign exchange reserves held by central banks across the world are in US dollar. After that, you have the euro, 90.60%, Japanese yen, 5.4%, pound sterling, 4.8%, other currencies, 3.9, Canadian dollar, 2.5, Chinese renminbi, 2.4, Australian dollar, 2%. So these are the most dominant currencies across the world, especially the US dollar and the euro. And the US dollar and the euro are used as international currencies, as currencies used to make payments, to denominate liabilities, and also to store value. And so these are really the most important currencies. And the other nations having weaker currencies, generally they need to have access to these currencies in order to make their external payments. And we'll see some of the consequences of this. So you have a domestic monetary hierarchy, but at the international level, you also have an international hierarchy where some currencies like the US dollar are at the top of the pyramid of currencies. Now, what is important is what is the value of the currencies? Because people often will ask what backs the US dollar or what backs the pound sterling. Here, you have a quote coming from the Bank of England. And because people ask the question to the Bank of England, what is the value of sterling? And they provided an answer. And here you have an excerpt. And the Bank of England said, since the Bank of England's the Bank Foundation in 1694, the banks has issued notes promising to pay the bearer a sum of money. For much of its history, the promise could be made of good by the bank paying out gold in exchange for its notes. The link with gold helped to maintain the value of the notes. Also, the link was sometimes suspended, for example, in wartime, let's say between the two world wars. The link with gold was finally broken in 1931. And since that time, there has been no other asset into which holders have the right to convert Bank of England notes. They can only be exchanged for other Bank of England notes. Nowadays, public faith in the pound is maintained in a different way, sues the bank operation of monetary policy, the object of which by statute is price stability. So basically, let's say until 1931, except for some limited periods, when you had a banknote of pound sterling, you could go to the Bank of England to exchange it to have gold. But since 1931, this is no longer the case. That means that the pound sterling is a fiat currency. If you come to the Bank of England to exchange your note, maybe you'll have a newer note, but basically you won't get gold or any other thing, just the note. So that means that the currencies are backed by the powers of the state, their fiscal powers, their military powers, their economic might. So there is nothing backing the currency as a commodity or something like that. It's really the powers of the state that back their currencies. And the powers of the state at the economic, international levels also explain to some extent, the hierarchy of currency we have seen. Here you could see a £5 note, and it's very explicit because it shows what is the nature of money. You could here read, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5. So this banknote clearly shows that money is a debt. Sovereign money is a debt issued by the state. And you could clearly see that money is not a commodity, is a debt. And this has very profound economic implications. So money as a debt is something known by, most tradition of heterodox economics. Here you have this quote from this very important American economist, Hyman Minsky, who said this: everyone can create money. The problem is to get it accepted. As we saw, we have a pyramid of monies, of debts. So everyone could create debt, but the problem is how you make your debt accepted. And empires, states have used a number of mechanisms to make their monies, their debts accepted. And one of them has been taxes. And here I will give the example of West Africa, French West Africa, called in French AOF, Afrique Occidentale Française. It was created in 1895. It was a federation of 8 territories. And the first thing the French did, French colonial administration, is to prohibit the use of local currencies. This was, for example, the case of Mania in Ivory Coast in 1895. Then they prohibited the importation of cowrie shells. Cowrie shells came from the Indian Ocean, and throughout the world, they had been used as monies, as means of payments. And they prohibited the importation of cowrie shells, and they said also that cowrie shells could no longer be used to pay for colonial taxes in 1907. In 1922, the cowries were demonetized. And there has been a revision of what was called the Code de l'Indigène in 1925, obligation to use the metropolitan currency under the threat of legal sanctions. So you have to use the debt issued by the colonial state. That means the colonial franc. Otherwise, you would be put to jail, etc. So that means that the tax system was used to impose, to make the colonial populations accept the new debt, the new money issued by the colonial administration. In the MMT literature, there is this idea that tax drives money, in the sense that tax is a way to make the money accepted, the sovereign money accepted. And historians Guyer and Palaver wrote in an article, in Africa, the circulation of colonial money was promoted by the introduction of taxes, the payment of wages in colonial money, and the demonetization on African commodity currencies. Matthew Forsater, MMT economist in 2005, wrote, colonial administrations did not need the colonial currency held by Africans. What they needed was for the African population to need a currency, and that was the purpose of the direct tax. This is something people generally do not understand, but the thing is, the currency is a monopoly. So if you are a colonized subject, you could not pay your taxes in the unit of account defined by the colonial administration, the franc, because you do not produce the franc. So the only way you could pay your taxes in franc is to work for the colonial economy, because if you work for the colonial economy, you could get some income, and from the income you get, you pay your taxes. Or what you could do, if you are a peasant, you produce products that are desired by the metropole. For example, the metropole does not desire, the food, but they desire cocoa, they desire cotton, etc. So if you produce those products, you could have the income, the franc, and you could pay your tax. Otherwise, they would put your parents to jail. So that means that tax drives money. That means that the purpose of the tax is not to finance spending. The purpose of the tax is to make you produce to work for the colonial economy. And this also meant that tax not only drives money, but it also drove labor migration. And here we have two quotes from Samir Amin. In the 1970s, they worked on migrations within West Africa. And he recognized the role of taxes in driving migration. He said this: in the interior, in the interland, within West Africa, Castor is serviced by an inefficient transport system where the government does not help peasants to intensify their agriculture. The levying of taxes in money has had the function of driving peasants towards the coast because there has been no alternative for them. There was sociologists speculating that, well, if there are some communities migrating, is because this is linked to their adventurous temperament, it is linked to the traditions they used to migrate, etc. But as a political economist, Samir Amin said, oh, no, these kind of cultural explanations, sociological explanations, they do not work. In fact, those who migrate are those who are proletarianized and those who need to have access to the colonial money. And he said, for example, in the case of Ghana, the Zama ethnic group may got to Kumasi as they used to go to war in the past, but the Zama do not immigrate because they have an adventurous temperament. No. They immigrate just because the colonial system obliged them to earn the money. And sometimes the young people had to migrate, otherwise they would put their parents to jail. So tax drives money and tax drives labor migration. So one way empires, colonial administrations used to impose their money, used to impose their debts, has been through the tax system. And this is still relevant because all the states use the tax system to make their currency accepted to the present. And these insights were not lost to a writer, Russian writer, Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy wrote this book in 1886, What Shall We Do Then? And it is remarkable that Leo Tolstoy articulated a kind of MMT capitalist views on money. And he stressed a lot on the violence of money in creating colonial contexts, in serving empire. Tolstoy acknowledged that the government sets the unit of account and the means of payment, that the currency is the government monopoly, that the obligation to pay taxes in the government's currency creates the need for people to find an activity that brings them the income needed to pay their taxes. The enjoyment, in brackets, of people's labor is the purpose of the taxes demanded by the government. Leo Tolstoy know all of this. He said also that money is a means of violence. He did not focus on the liberating rules of money. He rather described in details how money could be used to enslave nations, to enslave populations. And he said this in this book: where the violent coercion of one man by another exists in a society, the significance of money as a standard of values at once succumbs to the arbitrary will of the oppressor. And its significance as a medium for the exchange of products of toil gives way to its significance as the most convenient means of exploiting the labor of others. And he gave the example of how the Fiji was enslaved through the money system. So let's try to have a look at the colonial macro-financial scene, because it's really important to understand the monetary and fiscal dimensions of colonialism. Because once we understand that, we could also understand how our current monetary system works, because there's a continuity between colonialism, the colonial period, and now. So under colonialism, the metropolitan authorities, by which I mean the treasury and the central bank, they have their own imperial interest, which are not always congruent with the interests of colonialism. So there is a need to make a distinction between imperialism and colonialism. The imperial interest are not necessarily in line every time with the colonial interest. Colonial interest could be different. The colonial administrations, generally, they work on balanced budget. That means that they could only spend what they collected in taxes, not more. Just what they collect in taxes. This is balanced budget. And this is also an idea we will find in neoliberalism, the so-called idea of sound finance. And the colonial administration have to provide security and order, as well as sound conditions for capital accumulation by the private sector. That means the capitalist. The capitalists need the metropolitan authorities and the colonial administration to provide an environment where accumulation can happen with limited risk. In fact, the capitalists will never invest in the colonies if they know it's too risky. So the public authorities, imperial and colonial, they have to make sure that the conditions are adequate for private capital to invest. And in some contexts, these de-risking demands implied, for example, massive land dispossession of the natives and redistribution in their favor, to say that we will give you all these hectares of land. In case you fail, you could still use it to sell it again, etc. So in this context, the colonial context, monetary imperialism is indispensable for making the imperial colonial domination costless for the imperial state and the colonial administration. Because from a budgetary perspective, the imperial state and the colonial administration, they should not net spend for their colonies. No, the spending has to be financed, has to be backed by what they collected from the colonies. And they have to make sure that private capital, private metropolitan capital will profit from the colonies. So that is the context of the macro-financial scene. And this is also the same context. That means that every time the states will try to help their capitalists, their national capitalists, to obtain profits worldwide, and they will tend to limit, the cost of de-risking, the risk associated with, investment abroad. And there is something I would call the historian's original sin, in the sense that most historians of colonialism, they tend to equate economic borders with geographical borders, economic and trade borders with geographical borders. I think this is a serious error of analysis, because the stop of dominant economies goes beyond their territorial limits. The real borders, economic and trade borders, are monetary and financial. For example, the US economy goes beyond the US territory to include the set of assets, goods, services denominated or buyable in US dollar, as well as the foreign stock of physical capital controlled by US entities. It has been usual from Western historians of colonialism to view trade relationships between the metropole and its colonies as an international trade, ignoring the fact that due to the integration of colonies within the monetary and financial system of the metropole, this so-called international trade was actually internal to the metropole. For example, the trade between France and its African colonies was internal to the French economy, as the trade happened in the French currency and within the French financial system. This so-called international trade, as viewed from a geographical perspective, was not different from the trade between Paris and Marseille from a monetary perspective. Likewise, at least since the 1970s, the international trade between the US and other countries is internal to the US economy, to the extent that it is invoiced in US dollar and settled using the US payment system. From the US side, it's a domestic trade from monetary perspective. From the others, it's an international trade. But for the US perspective, it's a domestic trade. And this has been an error of analysis done by historians when they talk about the relationships between colonies and metropole. Here we have the sectoral balance approach, which is used on heterodox economic analysis. It's an accounting framework, very important because it's purely descriptive. It's always true. It means that the government sector balance, that means that the taxes less spending, that is the government sector balance, is always equal to the balance of the non-government sector. And by non-government sector, we are referring to the household sector, the corporate sector, and what is in balance of payment is called the external sector. That means the current account balance. So let's say that the government has a balance of 3% less, minus 3% deficit. So that means that the state spent 3% more than it received as taxes. So this deficit of 3% is matched by a surplus of 3% for the non-government sector. That means household, corporate sector, and the external sector. So every time you have a government deficit, that means that other sectors recorded a surplus. So this is the basic accounting framework, because generally people focus on the deficit, but omitting the fact that for every deficit, you have a surplus. For every surplus, you have a deficit. And we'll see how useful this sectoral balance approach is to understand public finance under colonialism. Because as we saw under colonialism, for the metropole, the colonial project was supposed to be self-financing. In other words, the subjugated populations were supposed to finance the colonial project, including the cost of conquest through taxes and forced labor. Metropoles were supposed to provide only ad hoc budgetary support to the colonial administrations, and the latter were supposed to have balanced budgets, essentially financed by taxes, a view called Gladstonian finance after the name of a famous member of parliament, British member of parliament. For example, if we take the case of the French West Africa, between 1844 and 1957, the French government devoted an average of only 0.3% of its public expenditure to French West Africa. The conquest, pacification, and the operational expenses of the colonial administrations represented more than 80% of these subsidies. Between 1907 and 1957, these subsidies represented an average of 2% of public revenues in French West Africa. Here you have a recent book on this, on the relationships between the French Empire and its colonies during the colonial times. And the author said, over more than a century, between 1833 and 1939, colonial administration cost the metropolitan taxpayer only 0.5% of national income on average and annually. Bearing in mind that at all periods, military expenditure accounted for more than 80% of the budgetary costs of the empire. So that means that in the colonial context, imperial context, all the costs have to be borne by the subjugated populations. He talked about the taxpayer, but as we'll see, this is a myth, because every time there has been a transfer of financial resources, it has been through bond issuances, not through, tax payments. We'll see that. Here you have another example of Belgian Congo, so-called Belgian Congo, because wherever the cost of military conquest had been low, the metropolitan contribution to the colonies had been negligible in absolute terms and inexistent in net terms. There has been an authoritative study on the fiscal costs of so-called Belgian Congo, currently the Democratic Republic of Congo, by Stengers in 1957. This study concluded the Belgian pensions budget alone constitutes each year for Belgium a burden almost double that which the Congo has caused in 70 years. That means that every time colonialism has been financed by the colonized populations and their nations themselves, not by the metropole or colonial administrations. So when a government has a balanced budget, that means expenditures equal revenues. This government does not create net financial assets, net financial wealth for the non-government sector, as we saw with the sectoral balance approach. So the first implication was the ability of the domestic private sector to accumulate financial wealth was made dependent on the generation of external surpluses, that means export income. Instead of producing your food, you have to produce a cocoa, you have to produce a cotton, etc., to have the export income. That's the only way the private sector could accumulate net financial assets. But generally, these external surpluses were, controlled by metropolitan private capital and was transferred to metropolitan banks. The second implication was that the absence of public deficits, because the deficits, as we saw, is the net financial wealth created for the private sector. So the state has to spend in order to create prosperity, and the taxes will come afterward, and what you will record will be the deficit. So when you don't have enough deficits on the financial level, you will have deficits on the real level in terms of livelihoods, in terms of conditions of living. And in the case of most colonies, it has been an underdevelopment of productive capacities, unemployment, underemployments, famines, etc. And you have a telling example with so-called Belgian Congo. And here is a quote from political economist, Franco-Asian political economist, Samir Amin, a very prolific author who left us in 2018. He wrote, he said during an interview, in 1960 in the Belgian Congo, there were 9, not 10, black-skinned Congolese who had high education, 6 religious and 3 civilians. After 30 years of one of the most odious regimes in Africa and the world, the regime of Mobutu Sese Seko, today there are not 9, but 3 million. So the worst regime has done thousands of times better than the beautiful colonization. In fact, this is ironic, beautiful colonization. But he wanted to say that the odious regime of Mobutu Sese Seko, which was backed by the West, created more prosperity in some sense than 70 years of colonialism, Belgian colonialism in Congo, because colonialism was based on this destructive idea of sound finance. The state has only to spend what it collects in taxes. So the argument has often been made in the metropoles that the money spent on the colonies would have been better spent in the metropole. You could every time see that, in the literature on colonialism. This view betrays an ignorance of how capitalism works, and especially monetary imperialism. This is an error similar to the one equating actual economic and trade borders with territorial borders. As we saw, colonial administrations functioned on the balanced budget principle, the ancestor of neoliberal sound finance. They spent what they extracted in taxes and forced labor. There were very little transfers from the metropole. When this happened, generally the financing came from bond issuances, not from taxes collected on metropolitan citizens or from metropolitan guarantees. These debts were often serviced by the colonies themselves from the colonial exploitation and theft of their labor and resources. And they mostly benefited the colonial interest, not the subjugated populations themselves. Today, we see the same logic being made. Rich countries spending on aid, so-called development aid, which is perceived as a drain on national resources. In reality, aid will often be dispersed to benefit the national private sector. Often the attention is focused on public balance sheets to the exclusion of private sector balance sheets, because what the state spends will be found as a credit on private sector balance sheets. So people will just focus at the deficits on the public balance sheets, but they will they will not make any effort to look at the private sector balance sheets, where this the said deficits will translate into private sector surpluses. And here you have a very interesting quote from French philosopher, liberal philosopher Raymond Aron. Raymond Aron was, a very smart man, and he understood how monetary imperialism worked. And in 1959, he wrote a paper assessing the future of French colonies in Africa. What kind of structures should be maintained? And he said this: the major fact that I would like to emphasize is well known to everyone, but I think it's worth thinking about. The circuit of payments between the metropolis and the territories of the community involves two movements in opposite directions and of similar amount. On the one hand, excess transfers of public funds from the metropole to the territories of the community is the empire, African empire. And on the other, excess private transfers from the territories of the community to the metropolis. To give you an idea of these figures, in 1957, excess public transfers from the metropole to the empire amounted to 70 billion and excess private transfer to 68 billion. So you had 70 billion earmarked for the colonies, but on the other hand, you will see that 68 billions will be recorded as private transfers, as profit transfers by the colonial interest based in Africa. And most of the economies, they could not understand why this happened. And you could see that this is pure accounting because the deficits of the state is somehow matched by the surplus of the non-government sector. So that means that this money could have been earmarked for the colonies, but they were spent for the benefit of French private capital. And Raymond Aron said, in other words, locally, public transfers from metropolitan France have a limited incentive effect on the development of the African economy in the strictest sense of the term. European economic chunks linked to the metropolitan economy are formed locally. A fraction of the African population is integrated into these chunks, but the majority of the population remains outside this European economy. So that the surge in imports that could theoretically occur does not happen precisely because an economic and social mechanism leads to the return of public funds to metropolitan France through the intermediary of French recipients of orders or salaries. So that means that public aid, aid earmarked for the peripheries, for the colonies, in fact, generally benefit mostly the domestic private capital. But here I highlighted in yellow the word return because for Raymond Aron, the money returns. But in fact, as Randy Ray used to say, money never moves. You know, the physical cash could move, but money is essentially something happening in balance sheets. That means it's just credit and debits. So that there is no return of money. So that means the money is just credited and debited in bank accounts. There is no return. The money has always been in the metropole. So these are things people generally do not understand, but money never moves. The resources, physical resources could move. The cash could move, but generally money is an electronic entry on balance sheets. So it never moves. So that means the money has never been in the colonies, but maybe some real resources have been shipped to the colonies. So it was important to say this. But we have also to contextualize that colonialism happened under a very particular international monetary system, the international gold standard. Under the gold standard, let's say, which started, let's say, the last quarter of the 19th century until, the 1930s, etc. In fact, the central banks, dominant central banks like the Bank of England had to back their currency, the currency they issued, with monetary gold. And whenever a state incurred trade deficits, that means it's imported bought more products from abroad than it's exported. Generally, this would mean loss of monetary gold. So during that period, Britain was the world economic hegemon, and the sterling was the world reserve currency. But Britain had less monetary sovereignty than the US would enjoy after 1970s. Because as we saw in the first picture of this presentation, in fact, the sterling was tied to gold. And when your currency is tied to gold, that means you have to have enough gold in order to provide for the conversions, demand conversions of selling into gold. And countries such as France, Germany, Japan, and the US, they were economically catching up with Britain during the last quarter of the 19th century. And Britain suffered trade deficits against these countries, meaning that it was theoretically losing gold against its rivals. But despite this unfavorable trade position, because when you have trade deficits and current account deficits, let's say external deficits, that means that you are receiving theoretically, in fact, financing from abroad to finance your deficits, normally from an accounting sense. But Britain was able to have these trade deficits with these, emerging countries, France, Germany, Japan, and the US, while being a net exporter of capital. Generally, the countries that are net exporter of capital are countries that have trade deficits, trade surpluses, external surpluses. But that was not the case of Britain. But Britain was able to sustain trade deficits against its rivals and be in a position of net export of capital thanks to the empire, thanks to the colonies, especially India. And what Britain did in most of its colonies, especially India, was to impose harsh colonial currency regimes, like, for example, silver standards, because these colonies were not allowed to function on gold standard because they could have lost gold. So they were put on silver standards or very vicious regimes called currency boards in West Africa and East Africa. Britain obtained the trade surpluses vis-a-vis its colonies because the trade was so unfair that, it was purely extractivism. And Britain appropriated the external earnings of its colonies because these colonies, generally, they had trade surpluses with countries outside Britain. And whenever they had trade surpluses, that meant that they were accumulating foreign exchange, they were accumulating gold, and this was appropriated by Britain. And this helped Britain to some extent, mitigate liquidity crisis in the London money market. And these colonies was also imposed a very vicious fiscal monetary regime, especially in India, where peasants, without their knowledge, were remunerated based on the taxes that they paid on their produce. This has been described, in details by Indian economist Utsa Patnaik. So after the Second World War, Ghana and Nigeria accumulated large sterling balances because they were part of the so-called sterling area, and they provided cheap financing options to Britain. So one mechanism of monetary imperialism is to have a control over the foreign earnings of the dominated countries, of the dominated territories. But after World War II, we had another form of monetary imperialism, the monetary imperialism of the US. The US emerged as the most important economic powerhouse globally and the issuer of the world reserve currency. But as the dollar was tied to gold, we had a different system there from World War II. It was the gold exchange standard, not the international gold standard. With the international gold standard, gold exchange standard, in fact, most of the currencies were pegged to the dollar, while the dollar was the only currency pegged and convertible into gold at a fixed rate. So this was the gold exchange standard, which was different from the international gold standard. So in that framework, the US had a balance of payment constraint because, as we saw, when you peg your currency, you have to make sure that you have significant foreign reserves or significant gold in order to honor all the demands of conversion of your currency into gold. So the US had a balance of payment constraint. But the US freely spent to finance the acquisition of foreign assets, for example, European companies, which, for example, General de Gaulle did not like, to finance military expansions and wars. And all of this spending increased US trade deficits. And so when the US has a deficit, trade deficit, that means other countries are enjoying a trade surplus. And so these countries are in a position of trade surplus. They were accumulating US dollar assets. And so they had a claim on US monetary gold deposits. So General de Gaulle, who did not like the US hegemony, played the game very aggressively and cashed in its dollar deposits from the 1960s, mid-1960s. So every time France would have trade surpluses with the US, de Gaulle will ask the Federal Reserve to give gold rather than US dollars. By contrast, Germany was in a subordinate position towards the US. So Germany, despite its surpluses, trade surpluses, could not cash in its dollar surpluses into gold. But the US military, among other factors, made the dollar peg to gold unsustainable. The peg collapsed in the early 1970s with the end of dollar convertibility to gold. So since then, as gold was demonetized without no one immediately realizing it, the US dollar as a free-floating fiat currency replaced gold as a reserve asset held by central banks. And that's what we saw in the third quarter 2023, 59% of all central bank accumulated reserves were denominated in US dollar. Before it was 70% at some point. I mean, 2 decades before it was 70%. So we could say that since then, the US enjoy a kind of a free lunch that what Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the French Minister of Finance, called in the mid-1970s, the US exorbitant privilege. And this US exorbitant privilege has been denounced by French economist Jacques Rueff. And he had this very interesting metaphor. If I had an agreement with my tailor that whatever money I pay him, he returns to me the very same day as a loan, I would have no objection at all to ordering more sweets from him. And this comes from Jacques Rueff. So the countries having trade surpluses vis-a-vis the US accumulate US dollar deposits. But generally, they usually invest these US dollar deposits into US Treasury bills. And interest rates on US Treasury bills are determined by the Federal Reserve. So these countries in surplus like China, Japan, etc., they are transferring real resources to the US quasi gratis. That means that when you are surplus and you use your surplus to invest in Treasury bills, that means that you have provided goods quasi freely to the US economy. By contrast, deficit countries, like many in the Global South, under the aegis of the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and World Bank, International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they have to endure austerity policies and policies that denationalize further their economies. That means that the IMF will say, oh, you have to cut spending, etc., budget balance. And the World Bank will say, oh, you have to privatize your most lucrative sectors, your banking sector, your extractive sectors, etc. And this will, at one point, create new crisis because you have no longer any control over the sectors that generate the foreign exchange. So in other words, Global South countries that can aspire to escape foreign debt crisis in the current context of this unequal international monetary system are those rich enough to deliver goods on a permanent and quasi-free basis to the US economy. And for commodity-dependent countries like most in Africa and Latin America, that means that countries that are willing to destroy nature to have access to US dollar deposits are those that could escape the debt crisis. So the situation under US dollar dominance is like this. Heads I win, tails you lose. There is no scenario in which you could win, because if you accumulate trade surpluses, you are delivering free goods to the US. If you are in deficits, the IMF World Bank will come and they will punish you. So this is the system under which we live. And there are some functions, of monetary imperialism, but maybe in the discussion I'll come about that. I have been a bit long, but the last thing I will like to say is that the CFA franc system, the irony is that it has been created by France in order to escape the structures of this international financial system dominated by the US. I will not have the time to develop on the CFA franc, but I will just say that it has been created in 1945 during colonial times after World War II because the French economy was devastated and the French currency has to be devalued. And at that time, there was this principle called monetary unity. That means that one empire, one currency. So the French currency circulated, across, the French currency under different, disguise with different banknotes, etc. But it was basically the French franc. And the French franc had to be devalued. And the decision has to be taken whether the devaluation of the French franc would be uniform across the French Empire. And secretly, the decision was taken to have different rates of devaluation of the French franc, one for the metropole and others for the colonies. And this decision, secret decision to implement uneven rates of devaluation of the French franc created the CFA franc in December 26, 1945. And so the French franc circulated in the sub-Saharan Africa part of the French colonial empire. And so more than 78 years after its birth, the CFA franc remains a colonial currency, a French-controlled currency system operating in 40 African countries. You could see them here. You have 8 in West Africa. My country is Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Togo, Benin, Niger, and Guinea-Bissau, a former Portuguese colony who joined the group in 1997. In Central Africa, you have Chad, Central African Republic, Cameroon, Gabon, Congo-Brazzaville, and a Spanish colony, Equatorial Guinea, who joined them in 1987. And the CFA franc, since its creation to now, rests on a number of pillars, 3 main pillars and so-called 2 counterparts. And you could clearly see their colonial and imperial, imprints. The first principle is the free transferability. That means the free movement of capitals and income between CFA franc countries and between them and France. I mean, between each monetary bloc and France, because we have 2 CFA franc blocks, as we saw, Central Africa and West Africa. The fixed peg to the French currency, French franc, and since 1999, the euro. And you have a third pillar, the convertibility guarantee by the French Treasury. So the centralization of the BCA, or the Central Bank of West African States, and BIAC, the Bank of Central African States. So the foreign exchange reserves were held in Paris at the moment of independence, 100%. And from 1973, this was lowered to 50%. And since the mid-2000s, it has been lowered to 50%. So the French government is represented in the organs of both central banks with veto power, implicit veto power. And since in 1999, the CFA franc is under the double tutelage of France and the Eurozone political and monetary authorities. I will not have the time, but what I would like just to say is that this colonial system, imperial system, which is still continuing, ongoing in Francophone and West Africa, has been created initially for France to have policy space in a world dominated by US dollar hegemony. And here in 1957, you could see a book published by the Director of Economic Affairs and Planning at the Ministry of Overseas France. He said in that book, a chronic shortage of hard currency means financial dependence on foreign countries. Financial dependence means political dependence. And he said the independence of French policy is linked to France's ability to do without American aid. As such, maintaining the French community could well be a necessary condition. Here you still have Raymond Aron, and he said, what I think we can say with almost scientific certainty is that from a strictly economic point of view, the advantage from metropolitan France is the participation of the overseas territory, that means the colonized territories, in the France zone, not sovereignty of France over its colony. And basically he was saying that as long as these countries use the CFA franc, remain in the France zone, in fact, France will continue to enjoy the same advantages, no matter granting them, political independence. So all of this, was known in the West, is known in the West, but there had been a terrifying silence on the CFA franc. Here, you could see now a declassified document, a memorandum, ordered by GFK to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, in January 1963, because JFK was puzzled by the fact that France spent more on its colonies in Africa than the US for the whole continent of Africa. And he said, why France could do that and we the US could not? Why France is spending more? And he asked Dean Rusk to make a report. And Dean Rusk provided this report, and he said, France's control over the monetary policies and foreign exchange reserve of the former African dependencies, coupled with a host of other trading relationships, enables it to recoup its assistance to these countries. This legacy from prior French colonial relationship implies a degree of external control over a country's financial and economic policies that would be unacceptable under other circumstances. This was 1963, and now we have 6 decades after that. This was also known to, U.S. diplomats, and here you have a book called African Betrayal, where the, French neocolonialism on the monetary aspects of French monetary were described in detail. Here as well, you have the former chief economist of the World Bank. He said that, well, I know that the CFA franc is handicapping the development and industrialization of Francophone countries. But my lips are unfortunately supposed to be sealed because I could not talk. And so that means that this system of monetary imperialism is known by those who benefit from it. And generally, as money has been, uh, kept as something that is too complicated for ordinary people, activist movement to understand, generally, there had not been a challenge from this side. But I hope that, we'll have the opportunity to enlarge conversations like this so that we could expose more and more facets of monetary imperialism in our current world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ndongo, for a very enlightening lecture. I don't know how much time do you have, but we would like to have the participants ask you a few questions, so you can raise your hand if you have a question, and I will give you the floor. But I would like to just start with a big general question, if that's okay. Like, so what does this mean for all of us? This whole system seems so big and confusing. Do we have any power over it? Did you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Ndongo, can you hear me? Ndongo, can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Okay. No, I was just asking just a big general question before we start with the participants. So I was saying that what does this mean for all of us? Because the system seems so big and confusing. And so if we have any power over it, was my question.
Yeah, in fact, we could have power over it because this system is first based on other forms of domination like military domination, political domination. So generally, you could not impose a system of monetary domination if you do not already dominate the country. Once you dominate, you could put this system. So in the case, for example, of African countries using the CFA franc, they have been politically and military dominated. And as we also, I try to show in my work, most of the people that rule our countries, they have been more or less people chosen or at least people who do not challenge French power, in our countries. So the political system, to some extent, reflect, French dominance to some extent. So that means that always the problem is political. You have to have the leadership, progressive leadership, committee to change that. But that's not enough. You have to have a domestic financial system because as long as your financial system, monetary and financial system, is controlled from outside, you could have no genuine independence. So that I think the for the global south, what we need is a kind of mechanisms of monetary cooperation, financial cooperation, where we could protect each other from various forms of monetary imperialism. But you need a progressive leadership, and you need some form of political independence, and also to work to have autonomous domestic financial system, monetary and financial system.
Thank you. So we have Sebastian and Salvatore. So you can just go ahead and unmute yourself, Sebastian, first, and then Salvatore can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for this talk. Very enlightening, and I have two questions. One is about where you could comment a bit on on China in Africa and based on its relationship with its investments in Africa and how that relationship plays out in monetary sense. And the second one is how cryptocurrencies come into play, like whether it has any redefining kind of role in this global relationship based on something that artificial. Of course, I understand that a lot of it is of social nature in any case, but how does that play out? Thank you.
Okay. In fact, whenever we talk about China is Africa, it's generally a bit polemical in the sense that there is a negative propaganda by the West about China. Generally, the West would say, "Oh, China is really dangerous. China is low, really exorbitant. Extra China is extracting African resources, extra." This is not aligned with fact. This is pure propaganda. The thing is, China has given African countries other forms of partnership, other opportunities. I mean, China has contributed to build a multipolar world, and the African countries are trying, to negotiate, to leverage this multipolar world. So that does not mean that everything is perfect with China, etc. But that means that China has been doing nothing. I mean, that is mirroring, the imperialist practices of the West, for example. One thing is that our trade with China, for now, does not change our economic specialization because we are just selling raw materials to China, and this have to change. China has been building infrastructure, etc. Maybe it would be good that we have the capacity to build infrastructure. China could provide finance, technology, etc. These kind of things. But it's up to African countries to come up with such a blueprint, etc. To how to negotiate. But generally speaking, when it comes to the debt, I mean, finance relationships, etc., there is nothing, I mean, particular to China. I mean, there have been a lot of propaganda, negative propaganda, and all this propaganda is debunked by serious academic work. For example, when we talk about Chinese debt trap diplomacy, etc., it does not exist. And I think we have to find a way of having more balanced relationships with China, in a sense that trade relationships, finance relationships, which will help us, grow, but also have industrial capacity, etc. To become more technologically independent, more financially independent. About cryptocurrencies, myself, I'm not a fan of cryptocurrencies because cryptocurrencies for me are not money. I would consider them as financial asset. And I think monetary sovereignty means that you have a central authority that has a monopoly over the issuance of the currency. And if the central authorities act for public purpose, they could, issue the currency in a way that will fill, the desired, social needs, the needs of the people. And I don't see how you could do that with a system based on cryptocurrency. I'm not talking about, blockchain technology, etc. But cryptocurrencies themselves, for me, they are financial assets, and so they do not really play the role of money. And we need sovereign money in some sense to meet, societal goals. So, I mean, sovereign money in a reformed, international financial system.
Salvatore, you can go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Ndongo, for the very interesting lecture. It's been a pleasure hearing you. So, building up on your latest response, right? The problem that you highlight for the African country in particular is that they don't have financial systems that they can control, right? They are dependent from the currencies or financial system that are under control from a country which is outside. I would like to hear your opinion about a supranational currency, something like the Bancor, which was proposed by Keynes at the Bretton Woods conference. That was the purpose of which would be to have like United Nations, a supranational agency to equalize the balance of payments between countries and have a currency which serves as an equalizer for not serving a particular country, it's like the US or the Eurozone, but in the interest of the overall stability of the global economy. What is your opinion on that, and how feasible you think this will come to be in our lifetime at least? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salvatore. I think these are the type of proposals that we need. The banker proposal, how to be in a system where we won't have a dominating currency, because we could de-dollarize, but we could be in a system similar to the dollar system in the sense that we will have one hegemony currency, which be the world reserve asset. We have to escape that. And I think the Bangkok proposal is a proposal in that direction. So these are the kind of proposals we need. But we know that, I mean, at the time Keynes made that proposal, it was refused by the US. And now we are in a period of heightened, rivalries between, let's say, the US, China, US against China, Russia, etc. I do not see that proposal coming. I don't see that. I don't think, but I may be wrong, it's just a feeling. I don't think that you could reform the international financial system as it is, the international financial system based on the Bretton Woods system. What seems to be more feasible, more likely, possibly, is a multipolar world. That means you have different blocks, and you have different geopolitical interests, alignments, etc. And you have progressive blocks, which will maintain trade and financial investment relationships in a balanced way that will help, growth, economic development, etc. That's the way I see it. So we have many blocks, many different blocks, but we will not have this unified world under, kind of a Bangkok proposal. I do not see that, because, the declining hegemon, the US, will not accept that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat, but I'm gonna give the floor first to or I don't know if I'm mispronouncing your name, Cor, but please go ahead. You raise your hand, you can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for the lecture, Doctor. My question, I have two questions. One is, what is the way out for the African countries and the quagmire they're in? They're in now currently, according to the lecture that you gave out. So what is the way out? Because it seems like something that is not going to end soon, or because we're going, it's like we are suffering because of the colonial is what the colonials have done to us. And secondly, according to the lecture that you've given, how can you summarize the whole research that you gave just in a few words? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start by the second question. Well, to summarize what I said, I mean, the first point is that we are living in a system of imperial dominance, I mean, which is a continuity with what happened during colonial times. The forms are not the same, but we are still in a system of imperial dominance. And money plays a big role in it. But what we have to ask every time is, why do we need US dollars? Why do we need that? In the Latin American scholarship, you have the structuralist tradition, you have post-Keynesian tradition, and always you have this idea of a balance of payment constraint, foreign exchange constraint. But the question we have to ask, why do we need US dollar in the first place? Well, we need US dollars because there are some imports that are important and we need them. I think that's a basic response. And some imports, you need them because you can't produce them. Or generally, it's not in your interest to produce them because maybe it's not strategic. So that means that whenever we talk about money, we have also take into account technology. and resource constraints. Because everything you could do as a nation from a technical and material point of view, you could finance yourself because money is debt issued by the governments and the banking system, the financial system. So that means whatever you could do, you could afford, you could finance. So the thing is, do you have the real resources? And in the South, global South, our development models have been based on Western technology to some extent. So as long as a peripheral nation, you pattern your economic development strategy on foreign resources you could not control. If you are not rich enough, like for example, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or you have the trade surpluses of China, you will go through debt crisis because you could not have an economic development model that relies on foreign real resources. You have to generate yourself your own technology or find a way to have access to others' technologies in your own currency. That's why we need a reform of the international payment system. If countries are allowed to buy the goods they need, the imports they need in their foreign currency, this will lower the possibility of debt crisis, international debt crisis, balance of payment crisis, etc. But we don't have this possibility. So as long as this international system is not reformed in that way, that means that you have two countries who are rich enough and who could escape debt crisis generally by destroying the environment, by extractivism, extra, and countries that are poor that rely on development aid, etc., on borrowing more and going through periodic debt crisis. That's the alternative we have within this current system. So if the system is there, so I mean you have to tailor your own economic development on the resources you could command in your own currency. That means resources you could develop locally, or resources you could obtain in your own currency through economic diplomacy. That's how I see things. But most of our countries, we have been, educated to the idea that we don't have the money, we don't have the finance. We could always have the money, we could always have the finance for what we could do from a technical and material point of view. We might lack the finance for things we could not do. So for things we could not do, we have to ask, do we need them? Could we have substitute for them? And if they are critically needed, how could we obtain them without having to go through foreign debt or, having to go through foreign domination, because foreign debt investment also is a form of domination.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have two people in the chat. Evelyn is asking, so if the world is subsidizing the US economy, does this mean that we are indirectly subsidizing the US military dominance and thereby reinforcing the system?
Yes, yes. In fact, countries like China, in fact, they have been accumulating trade surpluses. So that means that they have been allowing the US to expand militarily. Because when you have trade surpluses, that means you are accumulating US dollars. And these US dollars, in fact, generally, they are central bank reserves. So what could you do with them? Generally, the safest assets is to, the US Treasury bills, Treasury bonds, and you will buy them, and the interest rate on them are controlled by the bank, the Federal Reserve, because generally the US will not allow Chinese companies, for example, to buy US companies, etc. So the only thing you could do is to buy, US Treasury bonds, bills. But I think these countries now, they realize that, their economic model, which is export-led, creates problem in the sense that they help maintain, this US dollar monetary military dominance, but at any time also they could be, their foreign exchange could be seized or confiscated by the US. Russia, for example, is a country that had accumulated, trade surpluses. At one point, the trade surpluses were mostly in US dollar, but Russia tried to have them in euros. But since this Ukraine, NATO, Russia war, we have seen that the Western nations, they confiscated Russian assets denominated in US dollar and euro. So you see that when you are in a position of trade surplus towards Western countries, it's really risky because now what they used to call the rule of law, they no longer respect it. At any point, they could seize your assets. They did it, against Venezuela. They did it against Afghanistan, and they could do it with any country that could defy this world order. So these countries have to change their economic development model, because having trade surpluses is a way of transferring real resources, real goods to the deficit countries. Deficit countries issuing, the dominant currencies.
Thank you. And we have our last question from Adrian. Well, he's very interested in you linking us to your academic work in regarding Chinese debt trap. He would be very interested in that. So you can just send us the information and we can share it in the chat. We have a chat for the whole class, so we can share it there later for everyone to see. And he writes, correct me if I'm wrong, but BRICS wanted to settle transactions in a basket of constituent currencies. Is that right?
Yeah, they have this project, the BRICS, but we'll see what will result of it. About Chinese debt trap, it's not my work myself, but work of colleagues, including Chinese colleagues, and I could share that, obviously. Yeah.
Thank you. So we will share that in the chat, and it has been an incredible lecture. And they're also asking if we can have your access to your presentation. So if you can also share it with us, we can share it.
I share it, yeah.
Perfect. So thank you again, Ndongo, for this amazing lecture, a great closing to our summer school. I want to thank all of you for being here for all the sessions and for this last session. And we will hopefully continue the summer school. As you know, as we've told before, was our experiment, the first summer school. So hopefully this will continue. We did send a survey in the chat, and we would love for all of you to answer it so that we know what we can improve and what you did like, so that we can maintain it. Again, Ndongo, thank you very much for your time and your valuable experience. And thank you all. And we will keep in touch in the chat, and hopefully in the next summer school.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.